Hi friends, Ray Lutz here. I want to take a few minutes to go over the tax cut and the budget deficit and other topics as fast as I can and get you to understand. This is a very hard to understand topic, and I figured out a way to kind of understand this by following the money through the system. Now remember, the federal government is the only entity that can create new money by law. It's the only entity that can do that. Now, all other entities under the federal government, such as state and local governments, and your own budget has to be balanced. You only can spend what you take in. Remember that every dollar that you have, that you spend, you've taken in from someone else. No one is allowed just to make new money from nothing. Now, there's one minor exception to that we're going to cover in a few minutes in terms of the fractional reserve banking that's allowed to happen, which is one complication we're going to leave out for a second. Now I'm going to start with a deck of cards. As we know, there's 52 cards in a deck. I guess there's a joker in here too. So we'll take that out. So we've got 52 cards to work with. And I'll put this down so you can see. Now what we're going to do is we're going to assume this money is paid to a contractor of the government. Well, the government gets to create this money from nothing, and then the question is, can they get it all back? And if they can get it all back, or if they get more than this amount back, then they would have a budget surplus over time, and they could pay off some debt. If they don't get it all back, then they're going to have a deficit. So we're going to assume that they spend this $52 as part of payment on, say, a bridge. Okay, so the first amount of taxes back will be $13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 13. Okay, so Fred gets paid, and he pays his taxes through withholdings, and this is sent back to the federal government, and it's done 8 times a month. And that means about every other day, the federal government gets their withholdings from these big companies, if they're big enough to have 8 times a month withholding schedule. So even though Fred may not get paid 8 times a month, the federal government gets their money back 8 times a month. Now the next person, let's say Fred has this much money left over after he has paid his taxes. He's got the $39 left, and so he goes out and, let's say, buys some window coverings for his home. And that person, they pay their employee, and the employee has a withholdings within the month. They have to do it. So this may take a month if it's a small company. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's the amount that person pays in taxes. And we got this much circulating, which is $29. Next person spends, pays their taxes. This person spends the $29. And then we have to have $7 go back to the government. Then 6, okay, and 4. This is at a 25% tax rate. Let's say, assume everybody has the same tax rate. $3, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, and then finally, I must have a little more than I expected here. So what you're going to have, though, is you're going to have some losses, because you can't, even if you had it run perfectly, this last card, you're going to take 25% and send that. You'd have to cut it up. Eventually, you're going to get to that last dollar and not be able to send it back. All right, so there's going to be some losses in the system. This is money that didn't ever come back to the government, maybe buried in the backyard, maybe returned in some other way. This money is going to come back. We're going to have a little bit less than what we started with, but it's going to possibly take some time to get this all back. If it goes 8 times a month and everybody is a big company, you'd have, and they spent it as quickly as possible, you'd have, you know, about 8 times 2 maybe, and it would all come back within a month. All this money comes back, or it may take more than a year to get this money back to the government. Remember, they're spending at all times, and it's coming back at the same time. So now we're back here, and notice a couple of things. First of all, we don't have more cards than we started with. There's only as much as you start with. Now there's one exception to that, and that is, we'll go over at this point, which is if we have debt money involved. So when this first, and I'm not going to count it out exactly, but we had 13, 10, 7, 6, 4, and so forth, on down, until finally we're down to just a card. And there's going to be a loss each time we do the spend. But let's say this person down here who has 2 cards. He goes to the bank. I'm going to use red cards for this. Takes his 2 cards and this is deposited in the bank. Then the banker gets to have a whole deck because they only have a 4% federal. He gets to loan out this whole deck just by having these 2 measly cards there. So this gets loaned out, and we go through the same process. A little bit gets returned at first. As it's spent, it goes through the system, blah, blah, blah. It comes around, and there's finally some that's left over. You don't get it all back, but remember, this is red money. This is future money that has been pulled into the present and needs to be paid off in the future. So all of this, even though it did come back in the form of taxes to the government and looks like new money, actually is going to have to be paid by the few people in the future to cover that. It's going to take away from money that if this debt money is paid off in the bank, then it removes money from the amount that could come back in taxes in the future. So you may look like you're getting more money right now in the form of this debt money, but it's going to have to then be paid off in the future. And as you average all that out, this debt money doesn't change anything because it has to be paid back in the future as long as you look over the long time scale. But if you get more of this happening, more debt money put in the system, it's going to look like you've got a balanced budget for a while, but it's only because you have so much red money floating around. Then in the future, you're going to have less money because more is taken off the table here to cover. So when in the future, this red money has to be paid off. And so then this money here gets spent, but all goes into paying this off. This doesn't all come back because it pays off that red money. It makes that red money disappear when I take the blue money and pay this off. But look, no money comes back to the government because it got this paid off. When you average that out over time, you're going to get a net zero out of the system. But what will happen at first is when you encourage, let's say, having a lower fractional reserve requirement, let's say taking it from, say, a 10% requirement down to 5% or down to 4% where it is, I understand now, that's going to allow more to be put into the system that is red money that has to be paid off later. It's going to make it look like you're doing so much better when you're not. They really want this to happen. They want to encourage people to be borrowing more, putting it on houses. They don't have as much of this happening. Now think back to the big crunch that happened in 2008. What happened then was you had so much of this red money out there that people were expected to pay off that they couldn't do it. Then all of a sudden, this, which was just based on the promise to pay it back, this money then disappeared, taken out of the system. And then you have this big crunch where there just simply isn't enough money to do what you need to do. How can you rectify that? Well, you can reduce taxes, which is what they're doing now. That's going to allow more money just to float through the system, and that's going to encourage to heat it up, or you could spend more. Now, one of the things that I constantly hear is the Democrats say, oh, well, we can't spend more unless we have more taxes, a one-to-one. It's a pay-to-play kind of concept. You don't have to do that. As you notice here, if I spend twice as much money, okay, and then I start taxing it at the same rate, 25%, take 25% of this, 25%, 25, 25, comes off at basically the same speed. It's not, the tax rate, the percentage rate, doesn't mean you can't spend more. You spend more, you get it all back at the same rate as you would if you spent less, you still are going to only get back what you spent, and you're going to get more back even though you didn't raise taxes because there's more that you've spent. So this idea that the Democrats have taken a bite of the bad apple here of saying pay to play, we're only going to spend what we already see is coming back in taxes is absurd, because you don't need to have the money already coming back that you're spending. You have to look at this the other way. This is not a tax and spend economy. It's a spend and tax economy. You first spend the money, then you try to get it taxed back. If you tax it back slowly, you have more circulating in the economy, which heats it up. If you have a higher tax rate, you take more off the table. Let's say you didn't tax at all. What would happen is just the money would grow and grow and grow and be worth less and less. You'd have hyperinflation. You have to tax it back to get that money to be worth something. If you're taxing back too fast, the money is going to increase in value. You're going to get what they call deflation. Each dollar is going to be worth more if you're taxing it back too quickly. So taxation, in effect, gives money its value. If you only have so much out there, that's what gives its value. You have a finite amount of money out there, then you're going to have that value. Now look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin has a certain set amount of coins out there, a certain number of thousands of coins. And now the value is going up because more people want to use those Bitcoins. It's constrained in the number of Bitcoins. That's just like constantly taxing it back. So in essence, there's two things going on that you hear. One, balance the budget. We've got to balance the budget, and we can pay off that national debt. That's going to kill us. And we're bankrupt. We've got trillions of dollars in debt. First of all, this is all nonsense. You have to have a little bit of loss every time you do a spend. You're not going to get it all back, and it's mathematically impossible to get back that last little bit. If you get down to the last dollar, then if you're on a 25% tax rate, you would take 25% and 25% and so forth. You keep cutting that. You would get down, unless you go infinite amount of cycles, you will not get all of it back. That's just a mathematical fact. A percentage-wise tax rate will not get it all back, and it never gets more back than you put in. Long-term averages. You might get more back by getting this red money, which is the debt money, remember, from those the banking, the Federal Reserve, the fractional reserve system. Now, there's one thing I didn't mention here, and that is the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, even though the federal government is the only entity that can produce new money, when they get this new money to spend, they first borrow it from the Federal Reserve Bank. And so this red money will then be the amount of the debt. Okay, we don't get it all though. We have to come up with, we don't quite get it all because we have a larger debt than what we get here, because they have a percentage rate increase that they want. So this is the amount that we didn't get, and this red pile is how much is due. So then we go through our same process of spending, spend, tax, 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 and then there's a loss because we didn't get it all back. And now we come back and we say, okay, Federal Reserve Bank, we want to pay off our debt. And they go, oh, you don't have enough. We're going to have to loan you some more. They loan us a little bit more just so we can come up with the amount that is due. This goes over into our national debt. So over time, because of the losses and every spend, we're going to have to lose some money each time, and the amount from the Federal Reserve Bank that they want, which is a percentage rate, which, by the way, I believe never should happen. The Federal Reserve Bank should not be a private institution. It should be part of the government. It should just be a bookkeeping function and not have any interest rate tied to it. It's okay to have it, but let's not have that be a profiteering thing by the banks. So let's go over the story here. Number one, you can't have a balanced budget over time. To have a balanced budget amendment or anything of that nature is just complete farce. There's always going to be losses and you're not going to make it up. You're never going to pay off the national debt because you can't, unless you just coin a new dollar and just pay it off directly. You could do that. In fact, some people have proposed having a platinum coin that's worth $1 trillion and you pay off the national debt gone. You could do that. Or you just ignore it and say it doesn't matter, and that's probably what we'll do. The important part here I just want to emphasize is what the original spend is on. This is the only thing the government really can control for sure, is how it spends its money. If it's spent for things it has to do, such as military, employees, and so forth, that's going to come back directly. That's sort of at the bottom. If it's buying a bridge, then you don't want to buy the bridge from Taiwan and install it like they did with the Oakland Bay Bridge. That money then goes out and we have a trade deficit. So that's where we have the big losses right now. When we spend this money, if it goes over to China, we're not getting all of that back, and there's more losses in the system. If we had a trade surplus, then it could look like we're having a budget surplus for a while. In general, if we have a budget surplus, then what that is usually debt money circulating. And it means that we're going to have to come up with that in the near future, and then we're going to have a recession right after that. We can spend money without having to increase taxes. Tax rates are fine, and this is a fraudulent thing that the Democrats do by saying pay to play. That is not something that we should buy into. If we want to spend on infrastructure, then we should just spend it. We need to repair our dams, roads, and other infrastructure, the basic infrastructure of this country. We can spend that money without a problem. It all comes back as long as it stays here. If we spend it on things that don't improve the economy, such as a bomb or a war, that's not going to improve things. It's going to be a big loss to us. That first spend is important. So that's my little explanation of how I look at it. The Trump tax plan will probably improve the economy. It will look like it's increasing the deficit, but we should not worry about that. We should still spend more money on infrastructure, and we shouldn't worry about the budget deficit. We don't need to increase taxes in order to do those new spends. Thank you, and enjoy the new year.